My name is Tim O'Keefe, and welcome to Best Practices in Community Associations. It's a pleasure to be back this month. Last month, we got together and spoke about budgets, and we spent a lot of time with Monty Kane from MBAF and Roxana Dorigo, an Executive Director and Partner with KW, discussing budgets. We discussed budget timelines, reserves, handling surpluses and deficits in an association, and we covered a lot of ground. So today we're going to expand on the budget concept, and we're going to talk about something that is near and dear to most board members' hearts, which is cost savings ideas. We're going to bring in a couple of experts and talk about cost savings today. In order to do that, I want to address a couple other things before we get started, just talk about some of the recent events. As many of you know, over the past several months, we've had when we started our webinars back in March, they're really intended to educate and help board members become better aware of some of the issues with COVID-19 and how we could help you put best practices and approaches in place in your communities. Since then, we've moved to monthly webinars. And through these monthly webinars, we're focusing on more best practices for community associations on topics that we think you'd find most interesting. And thanks to all of you, we've had great turnout in all of our processes and in our webinars that we've had. In looking at what's happened over the last couple of weeks, we've had a very big difference from across the state or across the country. In California, we've had wildfires rage. We've had there are nearly 17,000 firefighters fighting 24 large fires. And on the complete opposite end, in Florida, just today, Hurricane Sally came on shore in Gulf Shores, Alabama, across the Panama City. Nearly 25 to 30 inches of rain has dropped in many of those parts of the country. So we are, I was talking to a board member the other day, and she said, I can't wait for 2020 to get over with so we can get a fresh start in 2021. And so we certainly hope that 2021 proves to be better. But some of the challenges that we face today regarding budgets and the fact that it's budget season, at KW, we start budget season in July. And that budget season is right in the middle of it. We want to get all of our budgets done by the end of October so that boards have plenty of time to get their budget approved, get notices out to all their owners, and have the opportunity to approve the budgets, along with statements or coupon books that they may send out. So in order to have the conversation about cost savings, I want to bring in our two expert panelists who have agreed to join us today. First, we've got Sandy Bennett, an Executive Director and Partner with KW Property Management. Sandy is responsible for our value optimization department and through that process has talked to many of our clients, helps find savings for them. Also joining us today is John Lyons. John is the treasurer for Paseo, a lifestyle community in Southwest Florida. And John's also a CPA and has done some great things and will be able to share some success stories in his community. So thank you both, Sandy and John, for joining today.
Thank you.
So in order to get started, I want to start with Sandy. So Sandy, you're responsible for the value optimization department at KW Property Management. So what exactly does that mean? What does the value optimization department, what's it structured to do? How's it designed? And how do we bring value to our customers?
Well, good afternoon, Tim. So our value optimization department was started out kind of with some grassroots, organic, let's see how we can save some money for our clients. And that happened many years ago and has really developed into its own department within KW Property Management. But what we do is our team puts together savings through various different areas. Sometimes it's specific to a property, other times it's global, it's to a region, and other times it's global to all of our properties. So our goal is to just establish some good relationships, get national vendors. It's not only through cost savings, but also through better services, and also having contacts at various companies with vendors that if there's an issue at any one of our properties, that we have the ability to go directly to a source and get problems resolved much quicker.
And so how does your department support the property and the budget process, Sandy? Because we've got over 100 managers out there managing 205 associations. And they're always looking for some help. And I know your department's super busy right now getting calls from managers and district managers. So what's the difficult call and how do we help with the budget process?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, our value optimization department is ongoing. We actually help our properties on the, back office support side throughout the year. When we monitor long-term contracts when they become due and help work with the on-site managers, district managers, and vice presidents at sometimes to go in and make sure that they're aware that they have these long-term contracts coming up. So we act as a reminder to work together with that on-site team. In addition, whenever there's contracts that are up for renewal, whether they're regular contracts, regular operating contracts, not long-term, same type of thing. These auto renewal processes, we try to, we educate our property managers to make them realize, to educate our board members, not just to let contracts auto renew. An auto renewal basically says, oh, I'm really happy with the service, vendor's been great, and let's just auto renew it. Well, with auto renewal comes sometimes a commitment and also price increases. So it's really that auto renew time is a perfect opportunity for our team to go out and work with that vendor to try to negotiate better pricing and then renew the contract. And we do this on an annual basis. As far as budgeting goes, obviously, I can't speak better about our team. Our team has just been going like crazy. It's been a great resource for our property managers and district managers to reach out when they're looking to try to forecast, to try to benchmark against other buildings, and to, again, same type of thing. That this is a perfect opportunity for each property manager to look through their contracts, look and see what they're getting, look at their renewals, and to see if there's any room for negotiations. And although a property manager sometimes has an ability on site to work with their direct vendor to get better pricing, once it gets back to the back office, we have a much better negotiating, ability, because we represent not only that one property, but for many. So we have a much bigger buying power with the vendors, and the vendors are much more eager to work with us to get that preferred pricing.
And so, Sandy, what are the typical line items where we can bring value to customers? How do we go about finding savings? What are some of the trade secrets that we use to try to find savings for customers?
Well, first of all, one of the things which sounds like it's a no-brainer is we look at sales tax. Whenever you have a property that's 100% residential, in some areas, and I stress some, such as utilities, they should not be charged sales tax. So sometimes it's as easy as looking at some of the utility bills to make sure that if it's 100% residential, they're not being charged sales tax. Another area that we look at is trash. Trash is really an area for big savings unless the property is in what they call a franchise city. A franchise city basically means that the city has already negotiated pricing with the trash hauler, and therefore you have set pricing there. But those cities and those properties that are not with the franchise city, we're able to go out and send out our relationship, the people that are our relationship representatives. They go out, they reevaluate the equipment that's there, they replace the wheels, for example. If the bins are in bad shape, they do repairs, and they also were able to go in and negotiate, based on other properties nearby to try to get pricing from them. We know where the pricing should be, and not only do we look at one hauler, we look at multiple haulers to see where the prices should be in line. Let me see. We have go ahead.
Sandy, one of the things that's interesting about that part, when you talk about, it doesn't matter how old the building is. Some may think, well, you have to have a 2 or 3 year old building to find that kind of savings, but we oftentimes find that buildings that have been around a long time have never looked at that aspect of it, and they can still get savings.
It's a really good point, Tim. What we find is, many times, again, it gets back to that auto renewal, and a lot of the trash contracts have built in there language that allows them to not only increase, but increase whenever they want to. And they do it by sending out a notice to the property and telling the property, if you don't refute it, then you're going to get this increase. So our value optimization department has gone back and reviewed these bills, and we see times where throughout the years they have 25-30% increases. Also, when it comes to overage fees, let's say, for example, there's a couple times where your bins are overflowing. These trash companies charge an overage fee. We've been able to negotiate with most of the large haulers to have that fee significantly reduced. So a lot of it's just is really part of education and being aware of what should be and what shouldn't be.
And so, John, a question for you. I know you are very methodical about the approach that you take to projects, and you've done some great things for your community. Like, what's the analysis that you consider when assessing a project before you just launch into it? Because, some folks aren't quite as disciplined or process driven, and they may just jump at things. What's an approach that you take that's the best practice that you think would be a good story to share with the folks that are listening today?
Sure. So, you want to try to get as much information as you can about a project. And usually these are major things where maybe you're using replacement reserve dollars. But the more you understand about what you want to do and what you have currently, you can pro forma and figure out what the benefit's going to be, whether it's reducing the amount that you have to put in replacement reserves in the future because you found a better alternative. But, you have to look at what the life cycle of something is, what the cost is to currently maintain it, those type of savings. And again, you look at it all and you try to make the best choice possible. We just replaced all of our furniture that, we had cushions, and we looked at what it cost to move those multiple times during the day. In Florida, it rains all the time. And we determined that we should leverage our replacement reserve dollars to buy a better product that worked in our environment better and ended up saving us about $30,000 a year on moving cushions and then even replacing the cushions that had a short life cycle.
Well, Cynthia in Miami Beach was interested in learning about some success stories regarding cost reduction. So, like, when you did that, that's a great example of something that you were creative. Like, what kind of a savings did you get from that?
Well, the furniture that we ended up buying was about $300,000 a year. So that has a 10-year life. It's about $30,000 a year that goes in the replacement reserves. We had actually more than that going in the reserves before, but our savings by not moving those and the labor that it took to do that was about $30,000 to $40,000 a year. So it ended up being a net savings. We did something else too, where our buildings were built in 2008. We had substantial amount of incandescent lighting, compact fluorescent lighting, which is a poor quality light. And we actually used volunteers. We switched out probably 500 different fixtures, either with drivers or just with bulbs. And we used volunteers, like I said, and we spent about $15,000, $16,000 doing that. But so far we've been tracking our electrical usage, and our kilowatts are down 18%, which for us is about $25,000 a year. So a lot's going on because of COVID-19. Well,
even though it costs $15,000, even though it costs $15,000, you're going to benefit by $25,000 this year and next year and the next year. So those savings continue forward for you.
Right, and it's hard to quantify really this year's savings because COVID-19 has impacted, operations. We're using a little less electricity for different reasons. But we felt like that was a 1-year payback, and that doesn't include the fact that now we don't have to replace, light bulbs. We don't have the maintenance to do that. And again, like you said, it's an ongoing 10-year. It's really what we call finance, a no-brainer decision to do things like that.
Right, and that's a really good point. So Sandy, when you're giving advice to people and you're talking about the cost of a project and what the long-term savings are, what's the typical payback that you expect to say, okay, it's worth making the investment? It sounds like John had a 12-month payback in this scenario, which I think anybody would say, yeah, it's worth spending the money on it if you get your money back in 12 months. But what would be a typical return on investment for an association that's going to invest in a big project?
Well, it really depends on the project. John is really talking about a lot of the LED lighting that you see. LED lighting is generally a no-brainer. Whenever we do these analysis, we work with third-party companies that come out and they run models looking at the different kilowatt hours and so forth, as John was talking about, typically we see somewhere between about a year and a little over a year is typical payback for LED lighting. But we have seen, depending upon where it is, if it's gone up to as high as 3 years payback. But as you mentioned, and John, confirmed, it's ongoing going forward. So it's beneficial to the association. Some of the challenges you have are the association sometimes don't have the cash flow to put up front to go and have these savings. So we have multiple vendors that we work with that will finance those projects. And yes, maybe your return on investment is not as quick, but it still comes out to, as we would call, a no-brainer, because eventually these savings outweigh the payments, and just kind of postpones that return on investment just a little longer.
Yeah, and we did a few other things. I mean, we went through, we had several occupancy sensors that weren't working, so we replaced all those. We changed our street lights to LED. We put in astro timers, which are a special timer that change every day for, dusk to dawn. We looked at, we have a marquee for our theater. It was running, 12 hours a day, every day. We changed those things so that it would shut off, at midnight, so it wasn't on all the time. So it's just really looking at how you're using energy, whether it's electricity or monitoring your autofills on your pools. In the summer it rains every day in Florida. Do you really need to have your autofill keeping the pool at the same level that you do the rest of the year? So there's just a lot of those type of what if we do something different, and then doing an analysis. Like you said, we have some really intelligent, talented people on our maintenance committee that did all the calculations for the kilowatts. But you're right, you need to have a nice, and it sounds like you talked about it on the last call, you have to have a nice operating surplus, and you need to have your replacement reserves as well funded as possible. So you can accelerate some of these things, like we accelerated our furniture replacement because the benefit was so strong to do that.
John, you talked about your lighting project that you were able to get volunteers. How many volunteers did it take? How did you guys go about engaging the community to the point where they were able to do provide some of the labor and save you guys money?
Well, you have to be careful about some of the things that you do to make sure that you're not using volunteers past the level of ability that they have. But we had a handful, 4 or 5 people. There was one, we have a bistro that has about 80 incandescent light bulbs that were burning maybe 16 hours a day. We switched those out with drivers, little LED drivers, and we did that in 2 or 3 hours. 2 of us did that. And it was just a matter of going in and unscrewing, light bulb, putting another fixture in, attaching it, putting it back up in the ceiling. So a lot of trips up the ladder, but it wasn't overly complicated. And really what everyone wants to do is leverage the talented people they have in their community, because people actually do want to help and volunteer and see these tasks get done. So we've had really good luck. We've replaced lines on the tennis courts with volunteers. We kind of redid our bocce courts with volunteers. We had some issues with umbrellas that we have a gentleman that was on our committee that's now on the board that was an engineer with Procter & Gamble. He redesigned the umbrellas so that they would function better. We had to tear every umbrella apart, but instead of replacing umbrellas that were about $100,000, he actually found a way to recondition them and make them work more efficiently. So it's
yeah, I think you're pretty fortunate
to do these projects.
You're pretty fortunate that you live in a community that has people that are willing to do that. You have a large community, but I think what's important is you mentioned, get people to help, but don't push them beyond their capability, because then you could get in some trouble there. And I heard you say you had people going up and down ladders. That puts a little pain in my heart, knowing that you've got volunteers going up and down ladders as well. So I'm sure you had spotters along the way to make sure they were that they were getting it done.
Safety is always the most important thing. There's no doubt about that.
John, you also talked about timers. What all did you put timers on? I know you said you had your lights, you had your marquee. I know there's a couple other things that you put timers on to help control the amount of electricity being used.
Yeah, it's like our street lights are designed to now come on, at dusk and go off, at dawn. And so there's not this window where they're on, 2 hours before it gets dark, or they stay on later, and they don't have to be monitored and changed. We did it with our tennis courts to kind of determine, what time of a different time during the year when they can come on and come off based upon how dark it is. We did it with our fountains. We did it with our pool lights, all those things that it's just automatic now that a light will come on at dusk and off at dawn, and it doesn't have to be adjusted for daylight savings time and those type of things. Now those were fairly expensive, $150 a piece, but again, we try to do things that the payback would be about a 12-month time period.
And so that's another good point, because something that I noticed at my own house. So I don't know, but in the middle when summer starts back in the middle of June, it gets dark about 9 o'clock. Now it's getting dark at 7:30, and I noticed that my lights outside the house aren't coming on early enough. So I need to adjust that dial back by a couple hours so that they come on when it gets dark outside.
Right. It's a safety issue as well, and that's another thing that was nice about converting all our street lights to LED. We had a lot of performance issues and maintenance issues. People having to come out, the street lights are 16, 18 feet up in the air. Very expensive to have those bulbs changed out, but we switched out all our street lights to LED probably a couple years ago and haven't had any failures. And again, the Astro timer, the lights are going to come on half hour before it starts getting dark. So you don't run in that situation where somebody hasn't adjusted it and it's not safe in the parking lot anymore. Somebody can trip because it's dark.
If I could just add a little bit to that too, and John lives in a very large, community that's more of an HOA, and some of the high rises, a lot of the lighting that gets replaced through LED lighting is through the garages. And you have to be really careful and make sure that the sensors are done properly, and that when someone goes in and tries to retrofit or change those bulbs, you have to be very careful because of the requirements for lighting that are, required by your municipality. Sometimes you take those light bulbs out and replace them with something. We've been told by some of the vendors that the safety measures are null and void. So obviously it puts the association up for risk if that's the case. So you want to just be careful and do your due diligence before replacing something like that.
Yeah, a lot of we obviously used a contractor to do, all that type of work. But
highly recommended, with that.
Yeah.
And Sandy, what are some of the other line items that you typically focus on? So we haven't talked about, the landscaping, irrigation, AC temperatures, pools, pest control, valet. There's a lot of other places where savings can typically be identified. How do you go about helping steer and guiding boards and our managers to look at some other areas?
Well, first of all, it's very important to stress that each property is different. So our value optimization team works directly with the on-site managers to see where they have deficiencies, to make sure that they understand the property better. Prior to COVID, we were doing a lot of site visits with vendors, and we would get the assistance with the vendor that's coming in to bid whatever service it is, to sit down and tell us what they believe that how there can be some savings. Actually reach out to them and encourage them to tell us how we could do some savings. Getting back to trash, for example, there were some properties where we were able to put in balers. There's so much cardboard that's out there now with Amazon and FedEx and UPS, so particularly now again during COVID, that some of our properties have been very successful actually paying for the baler, and it pays back right away because they're not charging solid waste charges for their cardboard or recycling charges. As far as the others, again, working with the vendors closely, again, it's very difficult to go and compare landscape, for example, from one building to the next. You're going to have two buildings side by side, 100 units each, and the landscaping, one is very plush and exotic, and the other one is not. So typically, the process we go through is we look for vendors that our other properties have been very happy with, and we have them go out and do a bid on the same type of project. That's when we know where the pricing should be. We all know that it's not always the cheapest price, but it gives you a good barometer as where you should be. So that's one of the keys, is pricing out vendors against each other and not just saying, oh, we have a great relationship with one vendor. Let's go look at the other vendors that we also have, and we pull them in from different areas, you know, where they do work within that same area. So it's beneficial to both parties. I do want to bring up another a topic real quickly, Tim, regarding COVID. During COVID, you can imagine people's budgets were all over the place. There were areas of savings. I know we've talked about this in the past, and then there were areas of extra expenses. Savings occurred as soon as, you know, COVID happened. We encouraged all, you know, through the value op team and working with our upper management, we advised our properties to go in and turn off the power or the electricity, certain items such as pool pumps that weren't being used, and certain equipment and television and the community rooms that weren't being used, to, you know, try to keep those lights off and keep the electricity down. And we've looked since then at some of the results, and it's been effective. There have been savings for the common area electricity. But then let's talk about water. Water, we're having a lot of properties that are now doing their budgeting, and they see all these people are working from home, and these water bills are astronomical. In certain areas, the rates, they vary, and the more water that's consumed, the higher the rate is. So like, for example, the first X amount of gallons are at one rate, but once you get to the next level of gallons, it's at a higher rate. So we have properties where their water sewer bills have more than doubled, and it's been a problem. So our value op team has gone and put together a whole listing of items to e-blast out to the residents to make them aware of water. I'm just going to go through a few of them with you. Some of them are like obviously some of them will sound obvious. Turn off the water when you're brushing your teeth, washing your hands, shorter showers. You know, this is, of course, is when there's a common area meter. So it won't apply to homeowners associations, but it will apply to high rises, because most high rises have a common bill, water bill, for all of their units. They don't pay separately like a homeowners association does. So we talk about switching low pressure shower heads, you know, just being, you know, changing the toilet flappers. You know how your water will run, and you know, when you flush your toilet, it just keeps running. People don't realize how much water that really uses. You know, you make sure you run full loads of dishes and laundry. And just, again, it's all about awareness, so that we can make all these units and these homeowners aware, and tenants aware of the water usage, which will hopefully help conserve some water and help lower these water bills. So you can imagine going into 2021 budget, the managers are like, well, what do I budget for water? We don't know when, you know, people are going to really be going back to work. So some of it is a little bit of a hybrid philosophy, and you just have to do your best guesstimate with respect to that.
And to that point, you talked about COVID and the impact on the budget. There are certain line items this year and in 2021 that will be higher than normal because we have more people working from home than people at home. So that's something to take into consideration in the budget. And John, I don't know if you've seen that in your property, if you've seen water usage or electricity go up?
Well, the Paseo master doesn't really, it's more the village center, you know, our lifestyle, so it's not individual condos or homes. But yeah, we had quite a bit of savings. We had, you know, issues with labor. We cut back some of our amenities. So, you know, when we did our budget, we tried to mainly base it upon our actual results from 2019, but look at things that happened in 2020 and try to incorporate those into the budget. So, you know, we had a net savings, there's no doubt, because of what happened. And, you know, we used that money to build up our surpluses, which, you know, you talked about some of the tragic things that are going on across the country. That's one of the reasons why you really need to have a nice operating surplus for some of these communities, because if something drastic does happen, a hurricane, you have huge deductibles, then you have money, you know, to fund that. The other thing I wanted to tap onto a little bit that Sandy brought up, you know, is do leverage your property manager and have them leverage other properties when you're looking at some of these contracts. And also, you know, try to make sure that that contract is all encompassing as best as possible, because where you really get killed with some of these vendors are, oh, you know, we didn't put the annuals in the contract, and that's some crazy amount. Or, it was this amount of mulch and you had more mulch, and the mulch is twice what you would have to pay for it if you had it built into the contract. So, you know, the more you know, the more, go back and look at those incremental costs that you had to pay outside of it. And, you know, we've done that here at Paseo. But, you know, whether it's irrigation repairs, if you have a lot of little minor repairs that are really hard to monitor, you know, try to get the vendor to build that into the contract so that, you know, you're not getting nickel and dimed, which doesn't end up being nickels and dimes and ends up being dollars.
And Tim, another point that we do is we try to have our managers look at their properties and look at projects that need to be done and see if they're able to utilize some of the on-site labor versus looking out for third-party vendors. Sometimes, you know, you can have someone who can, we have an example where one of our properties had a very old playground. And rather than going and replacing that playground, they had their maintenance people come in and sand it and paint it and refurbish it and bought a couple extra pieces. It was a brand new playground. So they saved significant dollars doing something like that.
We did that during COVID too, where we used the labor that we had since we weren't as busy to, you know, repaint areas, do things, power wash, things that were at their skill set.
Correct. And we did, again, same thing here as far as we recommended. There were savings. There were some savings in your fitness expenses, for example. You know, there were savings, like I mentioned, in electricity, but there were other items such as janitorial. You know, you had to make sure that your team and your people that you had, now you had to have hand sanitizers everywhere that you know, and you just needed to protect your on-site team as well. So those numbers have to balance out in 2020, and you have to try to project what that's going to be like in 2021.
Very hard to do. The other part of all this too, as far as maintenance goes, you know, it's really important to look at your PAR inventories for your supplies that you use regularly, because, you know, we lost a fingerprint reader and it took a while to get it, and then all of a sudden it's a rush order. But you should really look at what your PAR level should be for all those items that are that you need to use. You don't want to have too much inventory, but you don't want to have too little in the maintenance department. And you don't want to have to do a rush order to get some crazy little hinge for a gate that cost you, you know, $500 instead of having one on the shelf that, you know, you paid $50. The other thing too is you really need to look at your capital plan and work with the board members, need to work with their general manager to figure out which things they're going to do and have plenty of lead time. So you have the ability to look at a lot of vendors, get a lot of input from the community. So you're not making decisions when things break, but you're planning for replacing items that you know will need to be replaced. The more lead time you have, the better decision you're going to make.
So John is preaching to the choir here with respect to having adequate reserves, because exactly, you're giving perfect, you know, firsthand experience of having the ability to have that capital money there to spend to help improve your property when you need it, even being proactive versus the reactive. Instead of having to wait to get that special assessment, you can imagine properties that are suffering now that perhaps have a large amount of renters, and they're unable to collect their rent, therefore their owners aren't paying their assessment. Now they're going into a cash flow situation, and they still have repairs and items that need to be done. Where's that extra money coming from?
So, Sandy, a question that's come in from Andres is along these lines. Andres is asking, is it possible when doing a reserve study to adjust the study? An example, they believe that replacing a bathroom or renewing a management office due to lifespan, if they're in better shape, they're in good shape and don't need to be replaced. Can you change and save money? Because to reach the amount of reserves that the advisor is recommending, it could be too much. So like what's the guideline on reserves? If you get a reserve study from a company, do you have to believe it and use that as gospel, or does it serve as a guidepost for you?
So I'm going to preface this by telling you I'm not an attorney, but you know, obviously those reserve studies are there for a purpose, and that's why you hire your professionals and your consultant, is to give you some numbers to go by. Does that mean you can't take your reserves and just because it says you need to replace your restroom, you know, your bathroom this year, and you know it has 2 or 3 lives? The answer to that is, of course not. You just keep that money in there and you adjust your reserves, and you can do so on an annual basis. Should be reasonable. And again, you don't want to put the board and the association doesn't want to put themselves in any situation where it's going to come back and bite them. You have to rely on your professionals. There have been many reserve studies that have been presented to properties that we've worked with, and the general manager, you know, we get involved and say, wait a minute, why do you think this is going to be X amount of years? We believe it should be more. Get another, you know, sometimes you have to get a third-party vendor out there to come and give you an estimate or to agree or disagree with that or validate it. I don't believe there's any issue with not utilizing those exact numbers if you have a reasonable reason for not doing so.
Yeah, the most important thing really to the homeowners is that every year they're basically funding the depleted value of their replacement items every year. What you hate to have is charging them a catch-up fee to get someplace where you should have been before. So that's why, you know, the sooner you can get your replacement reserves, and I know hardly anyone has them 100% reserved, but you know, your goal should probably be at 75%, minimum 50% reserve. But yeah, anything that you can push off and not do that doesn't need to be replaced. Just because it says it should be replaced in 10 years doesn't mean that it should be. But when we do our budgeting, we look at everything that's current or up to 5 years out. And we analyze all those things to see if anything should be accelerated. And we have several things that we put off. That's just how it works. But there's also things that need to be moved up. And especially if you can find a better alternative that's more efficient and saves the operating cost. You know, it's much better to spend capital dollars smartly than to spend operating dollars, you know, every month.
And I want to stress with respect to your Florida statutes are pretty strict when it comes to how you regulate and fund your reserves. So it's very important.
The condos are a little different than the
correct. With condos and HOAs, they are different. So it's important to be aware of what is required for your association, what funds you can use versus what funds you can't use. When you need a unit owner vote to move money from one spot to another, or if, for example, you pool your reserves. So there's different methodologies as to how you fund reserves. But as John said, and again, it sounds, we keep repeating this, it's better to be proactive. I will say that when we were trying to be very proactive working with associations of ours, with COVID is right away when COVID happened, we reached out to those that were having some cash flow problems and helped them reach out to get a line of credit for emergency issues. And I will tell you that there are a lot of them that are using them now because of this collection problem that's starting to creep up on some of them.
So an example of this would be, I'm the treasurer of a condo, and we've got brick paver driveway. And when we had a reserve study done a few years ago, they said, you have to replace all your brick pavers in 35 years. So I went back and challenged that. I said, really, 35 years? They said, oh, they could last 50. It's like, well, why do you put 35 years if they could last 50? So to Andres' point, you don't. It's somewhat of a guidepost for how you reserve your money, but you can. You just have to feel comfortable that you're putting enough money aside that if you're claiming that it's 100% reserve, it truly is. Otherwise, you have to vote to not fund by 100%, something less than that. So we have another listener that says, in our last reserve study, it suggested to increase HOA dues 28% because reserves were not properly funded in previous years. Our arrears are $70,000. How should we handle that?
So there's multiple ways.
John,
Well, I'm just saying there's multiple ways of handling that. I mean, you can do a one-time special assessment. You could add in this shortfall in reserves in the current period, or you could try to catch up on them, depending upon where you fall within those Florida statutes of funding reserves. But
more flexibility with 718 than you do with 720. But yeah,
I think it's the opposite. You have more flexibility with the HOA, which is 720, than you do with the condo.
Yeah, you're right. HOA 720.
Yeah. And I've only figured out 3 ways to raise funds in an HOA or a condo. You can increase your maintenance fees, you can special assess, or you can go out and borrow money. Winning the lottery isn't an option, So, those are the only ways you can really try to increase the funds that you have available. And what's interesting is we have people from the East Coast of Florida and the West Coast of Florida that are on this call. And in the West Coast of Florida, they couldn't, many properties would never think of special assessment. And on the East Coast of Florida, many properties would never think of having reserves because special assessment is a way of life. So it really just depends on how conservative you are in your view of how much money you should have in the bank of your HOA or your condo association. And it's a different approach. It's, you pay me now or pay me later. You're going to need the money at some point in time, but the approach that you take to raise those funds is going to be different. I guess the other way you can get money is through an insurance claim. That's a nice way to, if there's a storm or something, you can get funds that way.
Well, I'll go back to something I said before. It's very justifiable to the members to say that you are paying what the depleted value of your assets are every year, that you're not creating a burden for somebody else future years, ahead. And, on the other side, it's real hard to justify to members that they're paying extra to catch up for something that wasn't done properly in the past. So a good reserve study, we've had two different ones where I am. The first one was done by an engineering firm. They only tackled the big items. The second one we did, we had an appraisal come in. We had a general manager that found the perfect person to do it. They did a very detailed roadmap, and there really is a different quality in the people that do these replacement reserve studies.
A lot of them do use certain models, Tim. They actually plug them into certain models. So when it gets back to that question that someone had about 35 years versus 50 years of pavers, where is that? It's really just an average. Sometimes just like you have an insurance appraiser or someone come in, you have to go and have that conversation and educate them into your property to make sure that reserve study is really reflective of your building.
Yeah, you should manage that process. I mean, we had a lot of things that had the wrong dates to them, the things that had been updated, but that person didn't have it. So you really need to sit down with your maintenance engineer and, in my case, the treasurer, and really work through that. We went back and forth several times on that reserve study to make sure that we captured everything. And then what I do during the interim periods is I take that reserve study and I roll it forward every year. If we use money and buy something that we didn't have before, I make sure that gets added to our reserve study. Or if we replace something and it costs a different amount, we change what was in the original reserve study with what we spent currently so that we have the most accurate report. And then when we have this reserve study updated, he can roll forward from his original report to where we are right now and all the changes to it. So the better information you have, the better it's going to be. Same as making any decision. The more information you have so you capture everything, the better decision you're going to make.
I think a really important point, though, too, is how strong of a preventive maintenance program do you have over the life of your property? Because if you fix things as they break, or you have brick pavers and they start to sink and you prop them back up, you're not going to get damage. And so let's take a generator that might have a 15 or 20-year useful life. Let's say it's got a 15-year useful life. If you maintain that generator properly, you test it on a weekly basis, you paint it. If it's leaking, you replace the valve or the bolts that are leaking. You can turn a 15-year useful life into 20 years very easily. That's how you save money. That's what good management company will do that for you. And one of the things that KW focuses on is having engineers on staff that can go out and walk your properties and focus on making sure that the assets that you have in the community are well documented, and then there's a good, strong maintenance plan in place to keep those assets lasting longer than they normally could. And that helps you a lot with reserves and building up the surplus of dollars that you need to replace them when the time comes.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, and the best way that you can add value is to not make mistakes. Not make the major mistake where you replace something that wasn't what you thought it was going to be, and it should have lasted 10 years, but it fell apart in 3 years. And that's where I think Sandy mentioned before, it's not always the cheapest, it's the best value when you do these things.
Well, we never like to talk about price, John. We like to talk about value because there's a very big difference between price and value.
Well, that's another reason why you want to have reserves, because you can make those better value choices if you have adequate reserves. If you don't have the cash, then sometimes you're going to make short-sighted decisions to limp yourself along. We had that happen at Paseo. Luckily, I wasn't on the board at that time, but we replaced a geothermal system that wasn't working very well with propane heaters. And we ended up spending $50,000 on the heaters, and we got rid of them in 6 months. We spent $100,000 on propane. We didn't negotiate the cost of the propane. So we spent $150,000 on this project and replaced it with a geothermal system for $180,000 that we haven't had any issues with at all. So, you know, those are the things that really create heartburn for people, is when you rush into something, you make a decision and it ends up being the wrong decision.
So Sandy, you know, speaking of propane, this leads to a question that Jack in Miami asked is, asking if KW has a list of vendors that provide preferred pricing to the properties that we manage.
Well, we're very cautious about preferred pricing, this concept. Yes, we have preferred KW pricing for sure, but I guess preferred pricing we do have. Preferred vendors is where we're very cautious. You know, we don't, as long as vendors are licensed and insured and do a great job for our properties and then willing to give us preferred pricing, we're willing to have a conversation with the vendor. So the answer to that is yes, we do have preferred pricing in most items. Not every item. We do have some national contracts and that are beneficial to all properties. For example, like an HD Supply, a Granger, Sherwin-Williams. So something that for our maintenance teams to as a go-to, where they get these, not only do they get major discounts on some of the top products that are purchased by most properties, but in addition to that, a flat off the price number percentage as a discount through national contracts that we have negotiated with them. You know, no shipping costs, things such as that really add up.
So another question that came in from Alicia, Sandy, said that you had mentioned earlier that properties that are 100% residential don't pay sales tax for vendors, and they have 3 associations: residential, commercial, and master. And she's asking, when a contractor services for residential, do we pay taxes, or can we fall into the rule of residentials do not pay tax?
So the sales tax law is pretty specific. For example, if you recall, I said some areas don't pay sales tax. So some of them, the areas that don't pay sales tax, if they are 100% residential, are, and I will answer that question, are electricity, gas, you know, natural gas and propane gas. What's important to, and there's also janitorial services. So for example, so when something comes up or comes, you know, sometimes we'll inherit properties too, for example, or we'll have self-managed properties that come on and they're not aware of these, and we're able to stop those costs, sometimes go back and get refunds of those sales tax. To answer the question about these mixed-use properties, it depends on how those mixed-use properties are structured. So for example, let's say you do have commercial and you have residential. If you have one meter that services both, guess what? You have to pay sales tax. A lot of the rates are based on that, whether or not you are 100% residential or not. We do a lot of the work with developers, pre-development, and we always stress to those developers, if you have commercial units and you have residential units, it is in your best interest of your property to have 2 different meters. One that services your commercial, one that services your residential. You can imagine, for example, we have a property that has approximately 700 units residential and 11 commercial, 1 meter. So here they are paying these 700 units, you know, the whole association. So that association, we came in after the fact, after this property was developed and after it turned over, and they're working on separating those meters, and they're going to find substantial savings. Again, the return on that investment is going to be pretty quick.
So another question from Alicia regarding reserves is that they use a pool method of reserves, and they're adding an AC unit to the gym, although that wasn't there before. and it wasn't in the reserve study. So they use reserve money to pay for that AC unit.
Typically, the answer to that is no. Your reserves are set up for specific items, and depending upon your statutory requirements, typically it's roof replacement, exterior painting and pavement, and any other item more than $10,000. I understand with the pool, with the straight line method, you have to use the amount of money that's accumulated for each line item. In the pool, you can pull all that money together and still utilize that money, but it must be used for the items that are in that reserve study. So if this is an item that really should have been reserved in the past, she should really consider exactly what John said. They wound up finding they had to replace something. So in the next year, they added that item to their reserves. So they started to accumulate money going forward. Did we lose Tim?
I think we lost some sound.
Oh, no, I muted myself so I don't give any feedback.
Well, you are back.
If delinquencies are high, how are you going to collect special assessments?
Well, whenever you do a special assessment, you have to take that into account. You have to say, okay, for example, I need to special assess $100,000, but I know that 15% of these people are not going to pay. You need to build that into your special assessment as well.
And I think it's also important to note for those board members that when you special assess or you go out and get a loan from a bank, explain what the collateral is on that loan, Sandy.
Typically, the collateral on that loan is future assessments. So as they see that you have this income stream coming in, that's what the banks are banking on, is getting repaid through those future assessments.
So they can step in front of you as the association and take the maintenance fees that are coming in order to satisfy the debt that you have with them. So if you ask the question, how can we afford to collect special assessment? If you had the special assessment and you decided to do it, you got to pay the bank too if you borrowed money. So if not, they can always, I've never seen it happen. I'm sure it does happen from time to time, but they can step in front of you and take your maintenance fees to make sure they get paid first.
It's important on that note, Tim, for everyone to understand that associations are really not for profit, meaning your assessments are really built on what your expenses are going to be. So you have to make sure that those assessments, the cash that you're going to collect, is going to be enough to pay for those expenses.
And then, Sandy, what are we hearing from insurance companies and utility companies as far as from a budget standpoint this year? What % increase are we seeing from those vendors that we would pass along to anybody listening today or to our clients?
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know the exact increases for utilities. Obviously, that's something we can get back at the next seminar, Tim. It's interesting though for insurance. Insurance has been going up 15, 20%, sometimes even more. So definitely insurance costs have increased. You can see we've had a very active hurricane season. South Florida and Southwest Florida have been pretty fortunate so far, but that will always dictate what happens with insurance going forward.
And then usually for utilities, a 2 or 3% increase on utilities is adequate. That's what I've seen in the budgets that we're working on right now. And then you're right, Sandy, insurance is really going up because this year is kind of a catch-up year from the last couple of bad weather seasons that we've had. And so this is the year we pay the piper, where I've seen 15% up to as much as 40% in some properties. But it's also important to note when your insurance policy renews. If it renews in May, let's say, you only have to budget for the 7 months at the end of the year of that increase. You don't have to budget for all 12 months. So make sure you understand for any vendor what month that vendor's contract begins or ends, so that you don't inappropriately budget for either too little or too much based on the increase that you'd expect to see from the vendor. And make sure that you're reaching out to all these vendors, and that's what all of our managers are trained to do. Reach out to the vendors, ask the question what kind of an increase they can expect, so that you hear it straight from the vendor and you're not making an assumption. We do have another question. If a building has, for the reserve method, they upgrade the equipment of the cooling tower and the cost was about $15,000. Can you pull those funds from reserve, or must they be paid from operating? Because that's creating a loss based on some of their challenges with COVID this year. So I guess if I'm understanding the question, it really depends on your reserve method, and if you've got reserve dollars to replace that cooling tower. You should, because the cooling tower meets the requirement for having reserves. So if you have to repair or replace that cooling tower, it's $15,000. You should be able to use money that are in your reserves to do that.
That's true. You know,
Okay.
Again, if it's part of the pooling, then yes, you know, you can use that extra money and then replenish it in the following year. If it's straight line,
So Sandy,
it's just
go ahead.
straight line, then you can only use a dollar amount that's accumulated for that line, that specific line item.
And let's say you're running short on operating funds, or you've had a challenge collecting. Can you use your money from reserves to pay for your operating expenses?
The answer really is no, particularly, obviously, if there's statutory reserve, you should not be touching those funds at all without a vote from your unit owners. Now, you can't bring that up to your unit owners and say, hey, we need to have this vote. You call a duly called meeting, and if you get the amount required of voting from your unit owners to move reserves from, you know, money from the reserves to your operating, you can do so.
Okay, so we're coming up on the end of the hour. So if I could get maybe a closing comment from both of you. John, what would be your best recommendation for best practices coming up on for budget season and for cost saving ideas? How can boards be creative to try to get more for their money this year?
I think we lost John.
Okay. I don't see them out there. So Sandy, same question for you then.
So the question is, how can you get more bang for your buck, basically, when you're doing your budgeting capital project? Well, number one is to make sure that you bid out your projects to more than one vendor, and you make sure that they know that that's happening, so that they tighten your pencils and make sure that you're bidding the same thing out to every vendor, so that you can understand where your competitive pricing is. And just to make sure that, you should, in our situation, we do ask that for some of the projects that they reach out to value optimization department, so that they can find out not only if there's other properties that have had similar projects and their experience with the same vendor or a different vendor. So that could be another option for for an estimate. And just, to make sure that it's all inclusive. John had mentioned something about that, making sure that you're not going to be nickel and dimed on the back end, because that can be much more expensive. Try to make it as all inclusive as possible.
So we're at the end of the time. So I thank you, Sandy. This is great advice. So I feel like we had a really great discussion today, provided all of our attendees with some practical ideas for reducing costs in your 2021 budget. Hopefully you all got some value out of that. Get a little more bang for your buck. I want to thank John Lyons, the treasurer for Paseo, and Sandy Bennett, executive director and partner with KW Property Management and Consulting. Good luck to all board members as you continue to work on your 2021 budgets. Be sure to rely on your management team to help guide the process. Please remember that today's session is recorded. You can watch this broadcast again or share it with a fellow board member by visiting our website at kwpmc.com. We also have a YouTube channel that you'll find on our website, and you'll find this webinar hosted there as well. We look forward to having all of our listeners join us again on October 21st next month. It's going to be a great program. It is election season, remember, and we will have Congressman Ted Deutsch from Florida's 22nd Congressional District join us again to provide a perspective on the political picture ahead of us and how these elections can affect your community associations. So send your questions in early, and we look forward to having you join us next month. From all of us at KW Property Management Consulting, let's do our part to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Keep wearing those masks, wash your hands, social distance, and stay healthy. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. And we're gone.